Imagine being pulled over by a racist police officer for no reason, only for him to release a K-9 unit on you only to regret it instantly. That's exactly what happened when a black U.S. Army general was stopped without cause. The officer's prejudice clouded his judgment, but what happened next left everyone, especially him, stunned. Stay tuned, because the general's response will leave you speechless. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. Major Malcolm Hayes, 45, had seen it all during his years of service in the U.S. Army. As a black man, he had faced his share of prejudice and discrimination, yet he always carried himself with dignity. A decorated officer known for his leadership and integrity, Major Hayes had earned the respect of his peers, even in the face of adversity. Today, he was driving through a quiet suburban neighborhood when, out of nowhere, a police officer pulled him over without cause. What seemed like a routine traffic stop was about to turn into a nightmare. Officer Travis Mercer firmly believed in the power of his badge. As a small-town cop with an inflated ego, he thought he could make snap judgments without consequences. He had little respect for those who didn't fit his idea of authority. When he spotted Major Hayes's car, something about it didn't sit right with him. Without any valid reason, he decided to pull the vehicle over, assuming the man behind the wheel was simply a black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. The setting was a quiet street, one where things were usually peaceful, even dull. But for Major Hayes, today would be anything but an ordinary drive. It would be a confrontation that changed everything. It began like any routine traffic stop, with Officer Travis Mercer fully confident in his position of power. But Major Malcolm Hayes was no ordinary driver. He was a distinguished U.S. Army general, a man who had dedicated decades to serving his country with honor. None of that mattered to Mercer, though. All he saw was a black man driving a nice car, and he immediately assumed he had something to hide. As the flashing lights appeared in his rearview mirror, Hayes let out a sigh. He had been in this situation before. This wasn't the first time he had been followed by the police for no good reason. He calmly slowed down, signaled, and pulled over, waiting for the officer to approach. His posture remained upright, his expression composed. He had no intention of escalating the situation. "Good evening, sir," Officer Mercer said gruffly. "I pulled you over because you failed to use your turn signal back there." Hayes raised an eyebrow, puzzled. "I did use my signal," he replied, keeping his tone measured, unwilling to let frustration show. "I'm not here to argue with you," Mercer cut him off, irritation creeping into his voice. "Step out of the vehicle, now." Hayes's patience began to wear thin. He was no stranger to being treated differently because of his skin color, but he still couldn't believe this was happening. "On what grounds are you asking me to exit my vehicle, officer?" Hayes questioned, his military instincts kicking in, keeping his tone respectful but firm. Mercer ignored the question and reached for his radio. "I need backup. I'm deploying the K-9 unit," he announced. The words hit Hayes like a punch to the gut. He had remained calm, compliant, and had shown no signs of being a threat, yet this officer was treating him like a criminal. Calling in a K-9 unit was nothing more than an intimidation tactic, a clear indication that Mercer saw Hayes as a danger without any justifiable reason. "You don't need to call in a K-9 unit," Hayes said, his voice still steady, but now carrying an undertone of disbelief. "This is unnecessary. I haven't done anything wrong." "Shut your mouth," Mercer snapped, his tone growing more aggressive. "You're not the one in charge here." The situation escalated rapidly, and Hayes could feel the tension rising. He had been in high-stress situations before, but this was different. This wasn't about military tactics or strategy, this was about racism, plain and simple. He kept his hands in plain sight, slowly opened the car door, and stepped out, making sure every movement was calm and non-threatening. His stance was steady, shoulders squared. He refused to let this officer push him into a reaction, as the man clearly wanted. "Step back." Mercer barked as the K-9 handler arrived with the police dog. The dog barked loudly, straining against its leash, eager to do its job. Hayes could feel the officer's eyes locked onto him, waiting for any slight movement that could justify his escalating aggression. But Hayes didn't flinch. He stood his ground, feet firmly planted. "That's enough," Hayes said firmly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that only years of military service could instill. "I am a general in the United States Army, and I don't have time for this game. You have no valid reason to treat me this way. You've just made a serious mistake." The officer froze, realization dawning on him. The K-9 still tugged lightly at the leash but was beginning to calm down, sensing the shift in the air. Mercer's gaze flickered between Hayes and the insignia on his uniform, the arrogance on his face gradually fading. This wasn't just any ordinary civilian, this was a man who outranked him in more ways than one. You're a general," the officer stammered, his voice unsteady. "That's right," Hayes replied, his stance unwavering. "I've served this country for over 20 years. I have fought for freedom and honor. And now I'm standing here telling you that what you're doing is unlawful." The officer looked rattled, unsure of his next move. He had thought this was just another quick show of power, a way to put a black man in his place. Instead, he found himself facing someone far more composed and powerful than he had anticipated. And now, even the K-9, once aggressive, was hesitating just like its handler. Hayes knew this wasn't just about him anymore. This was an opportunity to expose the cracks in the system, to ensure that his composure in this moment would serve as a lesson to everyone involved. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down. "What you just did was racial profiling," Hayes stated, his voice firm. "You had no reason to treat me this way, and I want to know why you thought it was acceptable." The officer slowly began to realize the gravity of the situation. The confidence he had started with was now replaced by uncertainty and anxiety. He had seen abuse of power exposed before, but this time he was the one in the wrong. "Call your supervisor," Hayes ordered, his eyes locked onto the officers. Mercer hesitated, feeling the stares of his colleagues and bystanders. Finally, he reluctantly reached for his radio. When his superior arrived, it was immediately clear that a serious mistake had been made. At that moment, the officer fully grasped the reality of the situation. He wasn't just dealing with any traffic stop. This was a reckoning. "Sir, I didn't know," Mercer stammered, his voice shaky. "You didn't know, but you judged anyway," Hayes said, his gaze unwavering. "You saw a black man and immediately assumed he was a threat. You deployed a K-9 without justification. I want to know why." Mercer swallowed hard, looking around. A crowd had gathered, and some had already begun recording. The K-9 unit that had been so aggressive moments ago now stood still, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The police officer took a step back, realizing the situation had spiraled out of control. This wasn't just a minor mistake, it was a moment that forced him to face the consequences of his own actions. "I didn't mean any offense, sir. Mercer stammered, but General Hayes cut him off. "It's too late for apologies. Call your superior immediately." Mercer stiffened, realizing the gravity of his mistake. Reluctantly, he picked up his radio, his voice uneasy. When his commanding officer arrived, the tension in the air only grew heavier. "I have been harassed and racially discriminated against," Hayes declared. "I demand an investigation." The senior officer cast a stern look at Mercer, noting the fear in his eyes. "Officer Mercer, you will need to write a report. This is a serious matter." The K-9 handler ordered the dog to stand down. Mercer, once arrogant, now lowered his head in regret. "Sir, I didn't know you were a general. I'm sorry." Hayes stared directly at Mercer. "I don't need an apology. I need accountability. This isn't just about me." His voice was low but carried immense authority as he locked eyes with the officer. "I'm not just a general. I've seen this system from the inside for years. And I know this isn't the first time." The officer's face paled. The truth was out undeniable. This wasn't just an individual mistake. It was a symptom of a systemic issue. "I've reviewed the data. I've worked with police oversight organizations," Hayes continued. "You are part of the problem, and now you're going to be held accountable." Mercer stammered, "You can't." "Actually, this is exactly the right time," Hayes cut him off. "You will be investigated." The commanding officer stepped forward, his tone firm. "Mercer, multiple complaints have been filed against you. You are hereby suspended, effective immediately." Mercer stood in shock. His once unquestioned authority had just collapsed. The realization hit Mercer like a ton of bricks. He wasn't untouchable. As he was escorted away, he understood that his mistakes weren't just personal failures. They reflected a larger systemic problem. Major General Malcolm Hayes hadn't sought confrontation, but he knew this moment had the power to create change. His calm yet resolute handling of the situation turned the incident into a call for justice. The news spread quickly, fueling discussions on police reform and racial discrimination. The investigation soon uncovered Mercer's history of misconduct, leading to his dismissal. But for Hayes, the victory wasn't about punishing one individual, it was about sparking a ripple effect. The incident ignited protests, anti-bias training programs, and increased transparency in law enforcement policies. Despite criticism, Hayes remained unwavering. He understood that change was neither easy nor comfortable, but it was necessary. His response had inspired others, proving that justice could be pursued not through anger, but through steadfast commitment to what was right. As the investigation concluded, Hayes's calls for accountability were answered. Officers involved in the incident, along with others with similar misconduct, were held responsible. The police department implemented broader reforms, from new community engagement strategies to stricter psychological evaluations for officers before deployment. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. The general's approach to the situation had planted the seeds for systemic change. And now, more people were beginning to take notice. On a larger scale, Hayes's calm yet firm stance became a model for others to follow. Social media erupted with support for him, with praise coming from all over the world for his ability to remain composed while demanding justice. This wasn't just about a general standing up for himself. It was about standing up for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly by the system, for all those who had faced discrimination or mistreatment. For Hayes, the most meaningful part of this entire ordeal was that the discussion surrounding his actions continued even after the story was no longer in the media spotlight. People were talking about reform, about racism, about justice. They were taking action, demanding change. Hayes understood that this moment was bigger than just one officer, and he knew it had ignited something that couldn't be easily extinguished. The lesson from this story was clear. Even in the face of injustice, it's not the loudest voices that make the biggest difference, it's the steady, unwavering ones. Colonel Malcolm Hayes didn't need to shout or react with anger. He simply demanded accountability. And in doing so, he inspired a wave of change that rippled across his community, his state, and eventually the entire nation. Racial injustice is a battle that cannot be won overnight. But Hayes showed that the first step is standing firm in the face of discrimination. The second step is ensuring that the system holds those responsible for injustice accountable. His actions served as a reminder to everyone that no matter your position or power, you have a duty to challenge injustice even when it makes you uncomfortable. Ultimately, Hayes' leadership didn't just change the course of his own life. It set the stage for future generations to understand what true courage looks like. It's not about using violence or anger to right a wrong. It's about using your position, your voice, and your actions to push for a better, fairer world. The general wasn't just a military leader. He became a leader in the fight for equality, and that legacy would last long after the headlines had faded. The impact of this incident wasn't just about a bad cop losing his job. It was about raising awareness and sparking real change. Colonel Malcolm Hayes' actions proved that you don't have to back down in the face of injustice. His refusal to overlook the officer's racial bias became a powerful statement for all those who had ever been affected by systemic racism. While Officer Mercer may have lost his career, Hayes' fight for justice left a lasting impact. The incident became a catalyst for law enforcement reform, highlighting the urgent need for better training and stronger accountability. It wasn't just about a single event, it was about changing the system from within. The general didn't just stand up for himself, he stood up for everyone who had ever been wrongfully targeted or discriminated against. The story comes to an end, but the questions continue to linger. In 2025, What will we do to confront the injustices that still exist? By 2030, will racism truly disappear, or will it continue to hide in the shadows of society? The answer does not rest on a single individual, but on all of us, those who have the power to choose between silence and action. Justice is not a given, nor does it exist naturally without those who stand up to defend it. A single determined individual can challenge a system, but to change an entire society, it takes more than that. It requires unity, courage, and perseverance. Prejudice does not vanish overnight, but small steps can create a wave of change. And each of us has the power to be a part of that change. What do you think? Do you believe the world will become a fairer place in the future? Or will we continue to witness endless struggles for equality? If you found yourself in a similar situation, would you choose to remain silent or speak up? Share your thoughts in the comments, because sometimes a conversation is the first step toward meaningful change. Personally, I believe that the transformation of society does not come from loud slogans, but from steadfast actions. When one person dares to stand up for justice, when a community demands accountability, when an entire generation decides not to accept injustice, that is when the world truly changes. If this story resonates with you, share it. Let it serve as a reminder that the future is not determined by what has happened, but by what we choose to do today. This story is entirely fictional and created for the purpose of raising awareness. It highlights issues of accountability, justice, and the importance of treating people with respect and dignity. We firmly oppose violence, prejudice, and injustice in all forms. Viewer discretion is advised.